Train your mind not to feel weak and distracted. You are not tired. You are not overwhelmed. You are not unlucky. You are distracted, trained to be weak, conditioned to escape the moment anything demands effort from you. And the most dangerous part is, this did not happen in a single moment. It happened quietly, one small decision at a time, without resistance, without awareness, without you noticing what was being built inside your own mind. Think carefully. How many times did you reach for your phone today without a clear reason? How often do you sit down to do something important and suddenly feel an urge to check something irrelevant, something that adds no value, something you will not even remember later? That is not random behavior. That is conditioning. Your brain has been trained to avoid effort and chase stimulation, and now it reacts faster than your intention. This is where most people lose control without realizing it. They believe they are making choices, but they never stop to question how automatic those choices have become. They confuse reaction with decision. They confuse impulse with freedom. And over time, that confusion turns into a lifestyle. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 1 that you have power over your mind, not outside events. But that power is not permanent. It is not something you either have or do not have. It is something you either practice or abandon. The moment you stop exercising control, something else takes its place. Distraction fills the gap. Comfort takes over. And slowly, your ability to direct your own thoughts begins to fade. Now pay attention to this. Your mind is always being trained. Every moment you give in to distraction, you reinforce a pattern. Every time you escape discomfort, you make it harder to face it the next time. This is not neutral. This is active conditioning. You are either building control or losing it. Right now, you are standing at a point most people never reach. Awareness. You are starting to see what is happening instead of blindly living through it. And that changes everything, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot pretend you are in control if you recognize how often you are not. There are only two paths from here. One leads back to unconscious repetition, to the same patterns, the same distractions, the same quiet loss of control. The other leads to something far more demanding but also far more powerful, a mind that does not react automatically, a mind that decides. What you are about to understand next will challenge something you probably believe without question, and once you see it clearly, it will be impossible to look at your daily life the same way again. The moment you realize you lost control of your mind. There is a moment that defines everything, and almost no one notices when it happens. It is not dramatic. It does not come with a clear signal. It is silent, subtle, and easy to ignore. It happens when you sit down to focus and feel resistance before you even begin, when the task is clear but your mind is already searching for a way out. You open your work, you know what needs to be done, but something inside you hesitates, not because you cannot do it, but because your mind has been trained to avoid the discomfort of starting. Then comes the negotiation. You tell yourself you will begin in a minute. You check something quickly, just one thing, then another. And without realizing it, you are no longer in control of your attention. Time passes, but not in a way you consciously chose. It slips. It dissolves. And when you finally look back, there is a subtle frustration, a quiet awareness that you did not do what you intended to do. Not because you made a deliberate decision to stop, but because you were pulled away without resistance. This is the real breaking point. It is not when you fail. It is when you stop questioning why you fail. It is when distraction stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling normal. That is when control is already gone. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by things but by their judgments about them. But there is something even more dangerous than a wrong judgment. It is the absence of awareness. When you stop observing your own behavior, you stop seeing the patterns that control you. And when you cannot see them, you cannot change them. Losing control of your mind does not feel like losing. It feels like routine. It feels like everyday life. That is why it goes unnoticed. You adapt to distraction. You justify it. You tell yourself you work better under pressure, that you need breaks, that it is normal to struggle with focus. And slowly, those justifications become your reality. At that point, you are no longer directing your actions. Your impulses are directing them for you. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reclaim control, because the pattern is now deeply embedded. The question is not whether this has happened. The question is how long it has been happening without your awareness. And more importantly, how much of your life has already been shaped by this invisible pattern. If this realization creates discomfort, that is exactly where change begins. Because in the next part, you will see why what you believe is a lack of time is actually something far more deceptive and far more dangerous than you think. The illusion of not having enough time. You say you do not have time. You repeat it so often that it starts to feel like a fact. But stop for a second and look closer. Time is not what you are missing. What you are losing is control over your attention, and that changes everything. Every day has the same 24 hours. That never changes. What changes is how fragmented those hours become when your mind cannot stay in one place. You start something, then switch. You try again, then interrupt yourself. You sit down with intention, but your focus is already divided before you even begin, and at the end of the day, it feels like time disappeared when in reality it was broken into pieces too small to be used. This is the illusion. It is not that you lack time. It is that your attention is constantly being pulled away, and without sustained attention, time loses its value. A single focused hour can produce more than an entire day of scattered effort, but your mind has been trained to avoid that level of focus because it requires discomfort. So instead, it creates a narrative. It tells you that you are busy. It tells you that you are overwhelmed. It tells you that you will do it later, when things calm down. But that moment never comes, because the problem is not your schedule. The problem is your inability to stay with one thing long enough to make it matter. Seneca wrote On the Shortness of Life that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. And that waste is not always obvious. It is hidden in small interruptions, in quick escapes, in moments where you choose ease instead of effort, without even noticing the decision. Pay attention to how this works. You begin a task. After a few minutes, you feel a slight discomfort. It is not pain. It is not exhaustion. It is simply the resistance that comes with focus. And instead of staying with it, you reach for something easier. A notification, a message, a quick distraction, something that gives immediate relief. In that moment, your mind learns something. It learns that discomfort should be avoided, that focus is optional, that escape is always available. And the more you repeat this pattern, the less capable you become of staying present with anything that requires depth. This is why you feel like you do not have time. Not because time is missing, but because your ability to use it has been weakened. You are constantly starting, stopping, shifting, reacting. You are active, but not effective. Busy, but not productive. Moving, but not progressing. And here is the uncomfortable truth. As long as your attention remains fragmented, no amount of time will ever feel enough. You could have more hours, more flexibility, more freedom, and it would still slip away in the same pattern because the problem is internal, not external. The moment you understand this, something changes. You stop blaming time. You start observing your attention. You begin to see how often you abandon what matters for what is easy. And once you see that clearly, you cannot ignore it anymore. Because in the next part, you will uncover the mechanism behind this behavior, the invisible force that keeps pulling your mind away and training you to depend on distraction without realizing it. The invisible addiction to stimulation. You do not notice it, but your mind is constantly searching for the next hit. Not something big, not something obvious, just small bursts of stimulation that keep you from sitting with stillness. A quick scroll, a new tab, a message, a notification, anything that breaks the silence and replaces effort with ease. This is not a habit in the traditional sense. It is closer to a dependency that rewires how you respond to reality. Your brain begins to associate relief with stimulation and discomfort with anything that requires sustained attention. And over time, this association becomes automatic. You start to feel restless without knowing why. You struggle to stay with one task even when you want to. You tell yourself you need variety, that you work better with breaks, that your mind just functions differently. But what is really happening is simpler and more dangerous. You have trained your mind to expect constant input, and now it resists anything that does not provide it. The most deceptive part is that this addiction does not look like one. It feels normal. Everyone is doing it. Everyone is checking, switching, reacting. So you assume it is just how life works now. But normal does not mean harmless. It means widespread. Every time you interrupt yourself for something trivial, you reinforce a pattern. You teach your mind that focus is temporary and distraction is always available. And with each repetition, your tolerance for stillness decreases. What once felt manageable now feels uncomfortable. What once required effort now feels almost impossible to sustain. There is a subtle shift that happens here. You stop choosing stimulation and start needing it. Silence becomes heavy. Focus becomes draining. And even when you try to concentrate, there is a background urge pulling you away, whispering that there is something easier, something more immediately rewarding just a click away. This is how your mental strength erodes, not through one major failure, but through thousands of small surrenders. Each one insignificant on its own, but together they reshape how your mind operates. Epictetus taught that no man is free who is not master of himself. But what happens when your impulses dictate your actions before you even become aware of them? That is not freedom. That is dependence disguised as choice. Now consider this. If your mind has been trained to rely on stimulation, then removing that stimulation will feel uncomfortable. It will feel unnatural. You might even interpret that discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. But in reality, it is the opposite. It is a sign that you are finally facing the state your mind has been avoiding. And this is where most people stop. They feel that discomfort and immediately return to what is familiar. They go back to the noise, back to the distraction, back to the pattern that weakens them. Not because they want to, but because they have never learned how to sit with that resistance. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to escape, something different begins to happen. Your mind starts to recalibrate. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your tolerance for stillness increases. Your ability to focus begins to return. And what once felt unbearable starts to feel manageable again. The problem is that most people never reach this point because they do not understand what they are experiencing. They mistake withdrawal for weakness. They mistake silence for emptiness. They mistake focus for effort that is not worth it. And because of that misunderstanding, they remain trapped in a cycle that keeps them distracted, reactive, and mentally dependent. In the next part, you will see how this pattern is reinforced by something even more subtle, something that feels safe, comfortable, and harmless, but is quietly making your mind weaker over time. The fragility created by mental comfort. There is something that feels harmless, even desirable, but is quietly weakening your mind every day. It is not stress, it is not pressure, it is not difficulty. It is comfort. Not physical comfort, but mental comfort, the constant avoidance of anything that challenges you internally. Your mind has learned to stay within a narrow range of ease. Anything slightly uncomfortable, slightly demanding, slightly boring, is immediately rejected. You switch tasks. You look for something easier. You delay. You escape. And every time you do this, you reinforce a dangerous pattern. You reduce your ability to handle even the smallest amount of friction. This is how fragility is built, not through failure, but through avoidance. The less discomfort you tolerate, the less capable you become of dealing with it. And over time, things that should be simple begin to feel overwhelming. You start noticing it in small ways. Tasks that require focus feel heavier than they should. Silence feels uncomfortable. Waiting becomes irritating. Even thinking deeply for a few minutes starts to feel exhausting. Not because you lack capacity, but because your tolerance has been reduced. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, Letter 13, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But what happens when your mind is no longer trained to face even mild discomfort? That imagined suffering begins to feel real. It grows, it expands, and it starts influencing your decisions before you even act. You begin to avoid things not because they are difficult, but because they feel difficult. And that feeling becomes enough to stop you. This is the shift that most people never notice. They are not avoiding reality. They are avoiding the sensation of effort. Comfort becomes the default. Ease becomes the expectation. And anything outside that narrow range feels like a problem. But the truth is the opposite. That discomfort is not the problem. It is the training ground your mind needs. When you constantly remove discomfort, you remove the opportunity to build resilience. You remove the chance to strengthen your focus. You remove the friction that forces growth. And without that friction, your mind becomes soft, reactive, and easily overwhelmed. This is why discipline feels so hard, not because it is inherently difficult, but because your mind has been conditioned to reject the very conditions that create it. You are not struggling with discipline. You are struggling with a low tolerance for discomfort. And here is the part that changes everything. Discomfort is not something to eliminate. It is something to use. It is the signal that you are doing something that matters, something that requires effort, something that will expand your capacity. The moment you start seeing discomfort as a tool instead of a threat, your entire perspective shifts. You stop running from it. You start leaning into it. And in that shift, your mind begins to change. Because strength is not built when things are easy. It is built when you stay, when you resist the urge to escape, when you continue even when your mind asks you to stop. In the next part, you will confront one of the most powerful shifts you can make, a realization that separates those who remain controlled by their thoughts from those who learn how to observe them without being ruled by them. Thoughts are not commands. There is a mistake that quietly controls most people, and it happens so fast that it feels natural. You have a thought, and without questioning it, you follow it. You feel something, and without distance, you react to it. Over time, this creates the illusion that your thoughts define your actions, when in reality, they are only suggestions. Right now, if you pay attention, you will notice something important. Thoughts appear on their own. You do not choose most of them. They arise, they pass, they change constantly. Yet even without control over their arrival, you often give them authority over your behavior. A thought says you are tired, and you slow down. A thought says this is boring, and you look for something else. A thought says you can do it later, and you postpone. None of these are commands. They are impulses shaped by your past patterns, your habits, your conditioning. Epictetus taught in the Enchiridion that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we form about them. But here's the deeper layer. When you stop questioning those judgments, they become automatic. And when they become automatic, they start controlling you without resistance. This is where most people lose their autonomy. Not because they lack discipline, but because they never learned to create space between a thought and an action. That space is everything. It is the difference between reacting and deciding. Imagine this clearly. A thought appears. I do not feel like doing this. In most cases, that is where the process ends. The thought leads directly to behavior. But what if you paused? What if instead of obeying, you observed it? You would see that the thought is temporary. You would notice that it has no real power unless you give it power. And in that moment, something shifts. You are no longer inside the thought. You are looking at it. This is control. Not the absence of thoughts, but the ability to choose which ones deserve action. The problem is that your mind has been trained to collapse this gap. Thought becomes action almost instantly. There is no pause, no awareness, no decision, just reaction. And the more you repeat this, the faster it happens, until it feels like you have no choice at all. But that is not true. The choice exists in the space you have not been using. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 47, that you have power over your mind. And that power is not about stopping thoughts. It is about refusing to be carried by them without examination. When you start practicing this, something changes. You begin to notice patterns. The same thoughts appear in the same situations, the same excuses, the same doubts, the same impulses. And once you see them clearly, they lose their influence. You realize that many of the things that stop you are not real barriers. They are mental habits repeating themselves. And habits can be broken. At first, this feels unnatural. Your mind will push back. It will try to pull you into the old pattern to make you react automatically. But if you hold that space even for a few seconds, you begin to weaken the connection between thought and action. That is how control is rebuilt, not in one moment, but in repeated choices to observe instead of obey. And once you understand this, you start to see something else. It is not the big decisions that define your mental strength. It is the small ones, the ones you barely notice, the ones where you either give in or hold your ground. Because in the next part, you will see how those small decisions, the ones that seem insignificant, are actually shaping your mind more than anything else. The hidden cost of giving in to small moments. You think it does not matter, just this once, just a quick break, just a small delay, something insignificant, something harmless. But what you do not see is that your mind does not measure actions by size. It measures patterns. Every time you give in to a small impulse, you are not just making a decision in that moment. You are reinforcing a behavior. You are casting a vote for the type of person you are becoming. And those votes accumulate, silently, consistently, shaping your identity without you realizing it. This is where most people underestimate the damage. They are not losing control in big, dramatic ways. They are losing it in small, repeated moments that feel too minor to matter. But those are the moments that matter the most. You decide to check your phone instead of continuing your work. It feels like nothing, but your mind registers it. You avoid a task because it feels slightly uncomfortable. Again, it feels insignificant, but your mind records the pattern. You delay something important and replace it with something easy. Another small decision, another reinforcement. Over time, these moments build a structure, not visible, not obvious, but deeply embedded. A structure where discomfort leads to escape, where effort leads to avoidance, where intention is constantly overridden by impulse. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, Letter 1, that while we are postponing, life speeds by. But there is a deeper layer to this. While you are postponing, your mind is being trained. Not in your favor, but against you. Each small surrender lowers your standard. It makes the next surrender easier. It weakens your resistance, and eventually what once required a decision becomes automatic. You no longer choose to give in. You simply do. This is how weakness is built. Not through failure, but through repetition. Not through one moment, but through thousands of unnoticed ones. Now consider the opposite. Every time you resist a small impulse, every time you stay when your mind tells you to leave, every time you continue when it would be easier to stop, you are also building something. You are strengthening your ability to choose. You are reinforcing control. You are shifting your identity. The problem is that these moments do not feel important when they happen. There is no immediate reward. There is no recognition. It feels quiet, almost invisible. And because of that, most people ignore them. But your mind does not ignore them. It is shaped by them. This is the turning point. When you realize that there are no insignificant decisions, that every small choice is either building strength or reinforcing weakness, that every moment of awareness is an opportunity to change the direction you're going. At first, this realization feels heavy. It forces responsibility. It removes excuses. But it also gives you something powerful. Control. Because if small moments can weaken you, they can also rebuild you. And that means change does not require something extreme. It requires consistency in what most people overlook. And as you begin to see this, another layer reveals itself. Something even more uncomfortable, something that most people try to avoid completely. Because in the next part, you will face why doing nothing, just sitting in silence without stimulation, has become one of the hardest things for your mind to handle. The anxiety of doing nothing. There is a moment that most people try to escape as quickly as possible. No noise, no movement, no distraction. Just you, still, with nothing demanding your attention. And almost immediately, something uncomfortable appears. Restlessness. You shift your body. You look for something to do. You feel an urge to check something, anything, just to break the silence. It does not come from necessity. It comes from a mind that has forgotten how to exist without stimulation. This is where the real dependency reveals itself. Not when you are busy, not when you are overwhelmed, but when there is nothing happening and you still cannot stay present. Your mind starts producing thoughts rapidly. Random ideas, memories, concerns, anything to fill the space. And instead of observing them, you feel pulled to react, to move, to escape, to replace stillness with activity. This discomfort feels like anxiety, but it is not created by silence. It is exposed by it. For a long time, your mind has been conditioned to operate with constant input. Music, notifications, conversations, screens. There is always something filling the gaps, and because of that, the absence of stimulation feels unnatural, even threatening. But the truth is the opposite. That silence is the baseline your mind has lost connection with. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, Letter 2, that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And that is exactly what happens when your attention is constantly moving. You lose depth. You lose presence. You lose the ability to stay with yourself. When you cannot sit in silence, you cannot observe your own mind. And when you cannot observe it, you cannot understand it. That is why distraction becomes so powerful. It keeps you from seeing what is happening internally. So when silence arrives, your mind resists it. It tries to pull you back into noise, back into movement, back into the familiar pattern of stimulation. Not because silence is harmful, but because it removes the escape. And in that moment, something important is revealed. The discomfort you feel is not a problem to fix. It is a signal, a sign that your mind has become dependent on external input to feel stable. Most people never stay long enough to see what happens next. They reach for something, they break the moment, they return to distraction, and the cycle continues. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to escape, something shifts. The restlessness does not last forever. The thoughts begin to slow down. The urge weakens, and gradually, your mind starts to settle. This is not immediate. It requires patience. It requires tolerance for that initial discomfort. But on the other side of it, something powerful begins to rebuild. Your ability to be present, your ability to stay, your ability to exist without needing constant stimulation. And once you start developing this, you gain access to something most people no longer have. Control over your attention in its rawest form. Because the mind that can sit in silence without escaping is the same mind that can focus without breaking. And in the next part, you will see how to take that ability and turn it into something structured, something intentional, something that allows you to sustain attention in a world designed to destroy it. The training of sustained attention. Your mind is not broken. It is untrained. And like anything that is not trained, it defaults to what is easy, what is familiar, what requires the least resistance. That is why you struggle to focus, not because you cannot, but because you have not built the capacity to stay. Sustained attention is not something you either have or do not have. It is a skill. And right now, that skill has been weakened by constant interruption, by fragmented thinking, by the habit of switching the moment something feels difficult. When you try to focus, you expect it to feel natural, but it does not. It feels heavy. It feels slow. It feels uncomfortable. And because of that, you assume something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. That discomfort is the training. Think about this clearly. If you have trained your mind to switch every few minutes, then staying on one task will feel unnatural at first. Your brain will resist it. It will look for exits. It will suggest alternatives. It will create reasons to stop. This is the moment that defines everything. Most people interpret that resistance as a signal to quit, but it is actually a signal that the training has started. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 6, paragraph 30, that the mind becomes what it dwells on. But there is another layer to this. The mind also becomes how it dwells. If it dwells briefly, it becomes scattered. If it dwells deeply, it becomes sharp. Training sustained attention means teaching your mind to stay longer than it wants to. You begin with something simple, not extreme, not overwhelming. You choose one task, and you stay with it. No switching, no checking, no interruptions. And almost immediately the urge to break will appear. That urge is the point of the exercise. Every time you feel it and choose to stay, you are strengthening your control. You are extending your capacity. You are teaching your mind that it does not need to escape at the first sign of discomfort. At first, your focus will be unstable. Your thoughts will drift. Your attention will weaken. But that is part of the process. You are not trying to be perfect. You are training consistency. Over time, something changes. The same task that once felt exhausting becomes manageable. The same duration that once felt long becomes normal. Your mind starts adapting to depth instead of resisting it. And here is where it becomes powerful. As your attention strengthens, your perception of effort changes. What once felt difficult begins to feel natural. What once required force begins to require less resistance. You are no longer fighting your mind. You are directing it, but this only happens if you stop escaping the moment it becomes uncomfortable. If you stay, if you repeat, if you allow the training to reshape how your mind operates. Because sustained attention is not built in one session. It is built through repetition, through discipline, through the willingness to face that initial resistance again and again until it loses its power. And once you begin to experience this shift, another realization emerges. It is not just about what you do, it is about who you believe you are while doing it. Because in the next part, you will see how your identity shapes your behavior more than any technique ever will. The identity of someone who does not drift. Everything you have tried so far may fail if you ignore this one thing. Your behavior follows your identity, not the other way around. You do not act differently first and then become someone new. You become someone new, and then your actions begin to align with that shift. Right now, whether you realize it or not, you are operating from an internal label. You might not say it out loud, but it is there. I get distracted easily. I struggle to focus. I am not consistent. These are not just thoughts. They are identities you have accepted through repetition. And once an identity is accepted, your mind works to confirm it. You start noticing evidence that supports it. You ignore evidence that contradicts it. You behave in ways that keep it true, even when you want to change. This is why effort alone is not enough. You can try to focus, try to be disciplined, try to resist distraction. But if your internal identity remains the same, your mind will always pull you back to what feels familiar. Epictetus taught that first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. But most people reverse this. They wait to become something after they act differently, instead of deciding who they are before the action. To stop drifting, you need to redefine yourself in a precise way. Not in vague terms, not in motivation, but in clarity. You become someone who does not break focus easily, someone who does not react to every impulse, someone who finishes what they start. This is not about pretending. It is about choosing a standard and aligning with it repeatedly until it becomes natural. At first, there will be friction. Your old patterns will still exist. Your mind will still suggest the same distractions, the same escapes, the same habits. But now there is a difference. You are not acting as someone who is trying to change. You are acting as someone who has already decided. That shift changes how you respond in critical moments. When the urge to check something appears, it is no longer just a decision about that moment. It becomes a question of alignment. Does this match who I am now? And when the answer is no, the resistance becomes easier to hold. Over time, this builds consistency. Not because you force yourself constantly, but because your actions begin to reflect your identity automatically. This is how control becomes stable. Not through constant effort, but through internal alignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 7, paragraph 54, that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. And your identity is the deepest layer of those thoughts. It shapes what you accept, what you reject, and how you interpret your own behavior. If you see yourself as someone who drifts, you will drift. If you see yourself as someone who directs their mind, your actions will begin to follow that direction. And once this identity starts to solidify, you will face a different kind of challenge. Not confusion, not distraction, but conflict. Because in the next part, you will see the constant battle between what is easy now and what actually moves your life forward, and why that conflict defines whether you stay in control or lose it again. The conflict between impulse and direction. There is a battle happening inside you at all times. It is quiet, fast, and easy to ignore, but it decides everything. On one side, there is impulse, immediate, emotional, effortless. On the other, there is direction, deliberate, intentional, often uncomfortable. Every moment you are choosing between them. Impulse speaks first. It is quick, persuasive, and convincing. It tells you to take the easier path, to delay, to avoid, to choose what feels good now. Direction is slower. It requires awareness. It asks you to think, to consider consequences, to stay aligned with something that may not feel rewarding in the moment. Most people do not lose control because they lack goals. They lose control because impulse is faster than intention. By the time they realize what is happening, the decision has already been made. This is where awareness becomes critical. You begin to notice the exact moment the impulse appears, the urge to stop, the desire to check something, the thought that says this can wait. And instead of following it automatically, you pause. That pause is where control lives. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 5, paragraph 1, that at dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself you have work to do as a human being. This is not about waking up early. It is about remembering your direction when impulse tells you to stay comfortable. Impulse is not logical. It does not consider long-term outcomes. It only seeks immediate relief. Direction, on the other hand, is built on clarity. It knows where you are going and what is required to get there. The conflict between them is constant. You will feel it when you are about to start something difficult. You will feel it when you want to stop before finishing. You will feel it when something easy is available and something meaningful requires effort. And in each of these moments, you are not just making a small decision. You are strengthening one side of that conflict. If you follow impulse, you make it stronger. You make it faster next time. You reduce your resistance if you follow direction. Even when it is uncomfortable, you reinforce control. You slow down impulse. You create space to choose again. This is not about eliminating impulse. That is not possible. It is about changing your response to it. At first, impulse will feel stronger. It will pull you quickly, almost automatically. But the more you pause, the more you recognize it, the more you choose direction, the balance begins to shift. Impulse becomes something you notice, not something that controls you. And this changes how you experience effort. What once felt like a constant struggle becomes a series of decisions you are capable of making with clarity. But there is still one misunderstanding that holds many people back. They see discipline as restriction, as something that limits them, when in reality, it does the opposite. And in the next part, you will understand why discipline is not control over your life, but the key to finally having control within it. Discipline as mental freedom. Most people misunderstand discipline completely. They see it as restriction, as pressure, as something that removes comfort and replaces it with effort. They associate it with force, with rigidity, with a constant need to fight against themselves. But that is not what discipline actually is. Discipline is not what limits you. It is what frees you from being controlled by everything else. Right now, without discipline, your attention is not yours. Your emotions are not stable. Your decisions are inconsistent. You react to what appears, to what feels urgent, to what demands the least resistance. That is not freedom. That is dependency on external triggers and internal impulses. When you build discipline, something shifts. You are no longer reacting to everything around you. You begin to decide what deserves your time, your focus, your energy. You are not pulled in every direction. You move with intention. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, letter 37, that if a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable. Discipline is what gives you that direction. Without it, you drift. With it, you move with clarity. Here is where most people get it wrong. They wait to feel motivated before acting. They expect discipline to feel good, but discipline is not built on feeling. It is built on decision. There will be moments when you do not want to continue. Moments when your mind suggests stopping, delaying, choosing something easier. And in those moments, discipline is not about forcing yourself aggressively. It is about remembering your direction and acting in alignment with it. The more you do this, the less internal conflict you experience. Because your actions stop depending on your mood. They start depending on your standard, and this creates something powerful. Stability. Your focus becomes more consistent. Your mind becomes quieter. Your decisions become clearer. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer negotiating with every impulse that appears. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Discipline protects that quality. It prevents your mind from being constantly interrupted, constantly influenced, constantly fragmented. Without discipline, your mind is open to everything, every distraction, every impulse, every external demand. With discipline, you choose what enters and what does not. That is freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you feel like doing. That leads to chaos, inconsistency, and eventually, frustration. Real freedom is the ability to act according to what matters, regardless of how you feel in the moment. And once you experience this, once you feel the difference between reacting and deciding, something becomes clear. You cannot go back to living unconsciously. You cannot ignore what you now understand. Because there is one final step, not a technique, not a strategy, but a decision. A quiet internal commitment that defines everything that comes after. The silent commitment to never be controlled again. There is a moment where everything becomes clear, not because something external changes, but because you see your own patterns without distortion. You see how often you reacted instead of deciding, how often you escaped instead of staying, how often you gave control away in small, unnoticed ways. And once you see it clearly, there is no going back to ignorance. This is where the real shift happens. Not in motivation, not in a temporary burst of discipline, but in a decision. A quiet, internal commitment that does not need to be announced, does not need to be proven to anyone, but changes how you operate from that point forward. You stop negotiating with impulses. You stop waiting to feel ready. You stop telling yourself you will try. Instead, you decide. You decide that your mind is no longer something that reacts automatically. You decide that discomfort is no longer a signal to escape. You decide that your attention is not available to everything that tries to capture it. This is not dramatic. It is precise. From this point on, when the urge appears, you will notice it. When distraction calls, you will recognize it. When your mind suggests the easier path, you will see it for what it is. And in that awareness, you will have a choice. Not always easy, but always available. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, Paragraph 48, that you can live a good life if you learn to ignore what is not in your control. But there is something deeper here. When you take control of your mind, you stop being affected by what once dictated your behavior. The world does not become quieter. Distractions do not disappear. Impulses do not stop. But they lose authority. You begin to experience a different kind of stability, not because everything is under control, but because you are no longer controlled by everything. And this is where most people fall back. They understand, They feel inspired, but they do not commit. They return to old patterns because the decision was never fully made. So this is where you stand now. You can go back to reacting, to drifting, to letting your attention be pulled in every direction. Or you can make a silent commitment that from this moment forward, you will observe before acting, choose before reacting, and stay when your mind tells you to leave. No one else will see this decision, no one else will validate it, but everything in your life will begin to reflect it. Because control is not something you claim once. It is something you practice, moment by moment, choice by choice, and the moment you stop giving it away, your mind stops being a place of conflict and becomes a place of direction. That is where strength begins.